The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of her private sitting room. Her fingers traced the cold glass while she watched the grounds below come alive with the quiet bustle of palace staff beginning their daily routines. The weight of recent months pressed upon her shoulders like an invisible cloak she could never remove. It had been 6 months since her cancer diagnosis, 6 months of treatments that left her feeling like a stranger in her own body. The chemotherapy had taken more than just her hair. It had stolen pieces of her confidence, her energy, and sometimes her hope. Yet she maintained her composure in public, the perfect picture of royal grace even as she battled demons that no crown could protect her from. William had left early that morning for an engagement in Scotland, his worried eyes lingering on her face before he kissed her goodbye. She knew he carried his own burden of fear, watching helplessly as the woman he loved fought an invisible enemy. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had adapted with the remarkable resilience of youth. But she caught them sometimes watching her with old eyes that children should never possess. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her turn from the window. Her private secretary, James, appeared in the doorway with his usual respectful demeanor, but something in his expression made her heart quicken. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carefully measured. "There's a visitor requesting an audience. Someone from your past." Catherine felt her breath catch. In the careful, controlled world of royal protocol, unexpected visitors were rare. Every meeting, every encounter was planned weeks in advance, vetted, and approved through multiple channels. For someone to arrive unannounced and actually be granted consideration spoke to either extreme importance or extreme audacity. "Who is it, James?" she asked, though part of her already suspected. "Miss Sarah Henderson, ma'am. She says she was your roommate at university. She's traveled from Canada and insists it's urgent." The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Sarah. Sweet, chaotic, brilliant Sarah who had shared late-night conversations and early morning lectures at St. Andrews. Sarah who had been there during those precious years when Catherine was simply Kate Middleton, just another student trying to figure out her place in the world. Sarah who had witnessed the early, tentative moments of her relationship with William when he was still just a boy she fancied, not the future King of England. They had lost touch gradually, the way university friendships sometimes do when life pulls people in different directions. Catherine's life had taken an extraordinary turn toward royalty and duty, while Sarah had pursued her dreams in journalism, eventually moving to Toronto to work for a major news network. Their last real conversation had been years ago, a hurried phone call after Catherine's engagement announcement. "Did she say what this is about?" Catherine asked, though she was already moving toward her desk to check her afternoon schedule. James hesitated, which was unlike him. In the 5 years he had served as her private secretary, she had never seen him uncertain about protocol. "She mentioned something about information, ma'am. Something she felt you needed to know before it becomes public." A chill ran down Catherine's spine. In her world, information that needed to be shared privately before going public usually meant scandal, exposure, or crisis. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone discovered something about her past? About Williams? Was there some long-forgotten incident from their university days that was about to be dragged into the harsh light of media scrutiny? "Where is she now?" Catherine asked. "In the blue drawing room, ma'am. I took the liberty of offering her tea while we awaited your decision." Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, weighing her options. The smart choice would be to have James politely decline the meeting and refer Sarah to the appropriate channels for media inquiries. But something in her chest, a flutter of their old friendship and genuine concern for what could be so urgent, made her hesitate. "Your Royal Highness," James continued gently, "I should mention that His Majesty has been informed of the visitor's presence." He expressed interest in the matter. Of course Charles would be interested. Her father-in-law had always been protective of the family's reputation, perhaps even more so since becoming king. The weight of the crown had settled on him later in life than expected, and he carried its responsibilities with the gravity of someone who understood how fragile public perception could be. Catherine made her decision with the same instinct that had guided her through countless difficult choices over the years. "I'll see her. But, James, please ensure that His Majesty knows this is a private matter from my past. Nothing that requires his direct involvement." "Of course, ma'am. Shall I escort you to the blue drawing room?" "Give me 10 minutes to prepare, then, yes." As James departed, Catherine moved to her dressing table and studied her reflection. The cancer treatments had changed her appearance in ways that makeup could only partially disguise. Her face was thinner, her skin paler, and, despite the careful styling, her wig felt foreign and uncomfortable. She wondered if Sarah would notice, if their old friendship would allow her to see through the carefully constructed facade. She chose a simple blue dress, something approachable but still appropriately royal. As she applied a touch more concealer under her eyes, she found herself remembering Sarah's laugh, her tendency to speak too quickly when she was excited, her fierce loyalty to the people she cared about. If Sarah had traveled across an ocean to see her, it had to be something significant. The walk to the blue drawing room felt longer than usual. Catherine's heels clicked softly on the marble floors as she passed portraits of ancestors and artifacts from centuries of royal history. Sometimes the weight of all that tradition felt comforting, like a steady foundation beneath her feet. Today it felt oppressive, reminding her of how far she had traveled from the girl Sarah once knew. She paused outside the drawing room door, taking a deep breath to center herself. Whatever Sarah had come to tell her, she would face it with the grace and strength that her position demanded. But underneath the composed exterior, her heart was racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The footman opened the door, and Catherine stepped into the elegantly appointed room. Sarah was standing by the window, her back to the door, but she turned immediately when she heard Catherine enter. For a moment, both women simply stared at each other across the years and the vast gulf that had opened between their lives. Sarah looked older, naturally, but she still had that same expressive face and keen intelligence in her eyes. Her hair was shorter now, professionally styled, and she wore a conservative navy suit that suggested she understood the gravity of requesting an audience with royalty. But her hands were trembling slightly as she held her teacup, and Catherine could see the emotion she was trying to control. "Kate," Sarah said softly, then immediately caught herself. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness." Sarah." Catherine's voice was warm, but careful. "It's been far too long." They performed the necessary courtesies, Sarah's awkward attempt at a curtsy, Catherine's gracious gesture for her to sit, the formal exchange of pleasantries about Sarah's journey, and the weather. But underneath the protocol, Catherine could sense her old friend's agitation, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting to be interrupted. "I imagine you're wondering why I've come," Sarah said finally, setting down her teacup with hands that weren't quite steady. "I am curious," Catherine admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "James mentioned you had information about something urgent." Sarah took a deep breath, and Catherine could see her gathering courage. "Kate, Your Royal Highness, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult, and I want you to know that I've agonized over whether to come forward. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. "Go on." "It's about William," Sarah said quietly, "and about something that happened 3 months ago when he was in Cape Town for that environmental summit." The words hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Catherine's mind immediately went to the worst possibilities: an affair, a scandal, some breach of protocol that could damage the monarchy. She had learned over the years to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. "What about Cape Town?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her chest. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope, setting it on the table between them, but not opening it yet. "I've been working as an investigative journalist for the past 8 years. I specialize in international affairs, political corruption, that sort of thing. 3 months ago, I was in Cape Town covering the same summit William attended." Catherine waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap, even as her heart pounded. "I was staying at the same hotel as the royal delegation," Sarah continued. "The Mount Nelson. I was there on assignment. Completely coincidental that William was there too. I wasn't even thinking about our old connection until I saw him in the lobby." "Did you speak with him?" "No. I didn't want to put him in an awkward position." "But Kate," Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper, "I saw something that I think you need to know about." Catherine's mouth had gone dry, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of royal training had taught her to never reveal her inner turmoil, no matter what bombshell was about to explode her carefully constructed world. On the 3rd night of the summit, I was returning to my room late. I'd been working in the hotel business center when I saw William coming out of the elevator. He wasn't alone. The words hit Catherine like ice water. She felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly, but she forced herself to remain still, to listen, to gather all the information before reacting. "He was with a woman," Sarah continued, her voice full of reluctance and pain. Someone I didn't recognize. They were clearly intimate, Kate. The way they were touching, the way they looked at each other. And she was wearing what looked like royal jewelry. A necklace I think I'd seen you wear in photos. Catherine felt the world tilt slightly around her. Her grandmother's sapphire necklace, the one William had given her for their 5th anniversary. She wore it to important state functions, considered it one of her signature pieces. The thought of another woman wearing it, of William giving it to someone else, made her physically ill. "Are you certain it was William?" she asked, though she knew Sarah wouldn't have come this far on uncertainty. "Absolutely certain. And, Kate, there's more." Sarah reached for the envelope with obvious reluctance. "I took pictures." Catherine stared at the envelope as if it might contain a venomous snake. Part of her wanted to demand that Sarah leave immediately, take her evidence and her suspicions, and disappear back to Canada. But another part, the part that had survived years of media scrutiny and public pressure, knew that ignorance was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Show me," she said quietly. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope and withdrew several photographs. She spread them on the table between them like tarot cards predicting doom. The images were clear, taken with a professional camera from across the hotel lobby and again near the elevators. There was William, unmistakably, in casual clothes she recognized from his trip wardrobe. And there was a woman, tall, brunette, elegant in a way that suggested wealth and education. In one photo, William's hand was on the small of her back as they waited for the elevator. In another, she was leaning close to whisper something in his ear, her hand resting possessively on his chest. But it was the third photograph that made Catherine's breath catch. The woman was indeed wearing the sapphire necklace, clearly visible against her black dress. And William was looking at her with an expression Catherine recognized, one she had seen directed at herself in their early days together, tender, possessive, intimate. Catherine studied the photos for a long moment, her mind working to process what she was seeing. The woman was beautiful, certainly, but in a completely different way than Catherine. Where Catherine was classic and refined, this woman had an edge, a sophistication that spoke of international travel and expensive tastes. "Do you know who she is?" Catherine asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. "I did some research after I got back to Toronto," Sarah admitted. "Her name is Isabella Montague. She's an art consultant, works with wealthy collectors and museums. British, but she's lived all over the world. She was in Cape Town for the same summit. There was a cultural exchange component that involved several art exhibitions." Catherine nodded slowly, filing away every detail. The art connection made sense. William had always been passionate about cultural preservation and had spoken several times about using art as a tool for diplomacy. It would be natural for him to meet with someone in Isabella's position during an international summit. But that didn't explain the intimacy in the photographs, the familiar way they touched each other, or the presence of her grandmother's necklace. "Sarah," Catherine said finally, "why are you bringing this to me? Why not take it to the press? It would certainly be a career-making story." Sarah looked genuinely shocked. "Kate, how can you even ask that? Yes, we lost touch over the years, but you were one of my dearest friends. I could never do something that would hurt you like that. I'm bringing this to you because I think you have a right to know what's happening in your own marriage before the rest of the world does." "What do you mean, before the rest of the world does?" Sarah's expression grew even more troubled. "Kate, I wasn't the only journalist at that hotel. I've heard rumors, whispers in certain circles. People are starting to ask questions about William's frequent travels, about certain women who've been seen in his company. This Isabella Montague situation might just be the tip of the iceberg." Catherine felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Not only was she potentially dealing with William's infidelity, but there was a possibility that it could become public knowledge at any moment. The thought of her children seeing their father's betrayal splashed across every newspaper and website in the world made her feel physically sick. "Is there more?" she asked, dreading the answer. "I don't have proof of anything else," Sarah said carefully. "But there have been other trips, other summits where William has attended social events with various women. Always with reasonable explanations, diplomatic functions, cultural exchanges, charity galas. But the pattern is concerning, and people in my industry are starting to notice." Catherine stood up abruptly, moving back to the window where she had been standing when James first announced Sarah's arrival. It felt like a lifetime ago. Outside, the palace grounds looked exactly the same, but her world had fundamentally shifted in the space of a conversation. She thought about William's behavior over the past few months. Had there been signs she had missed or chosen to ignore? He had been traveling more frequently, and when he was home, he seemed distracted, distant. She had attributed it to the stress of her illness and his increased royal duties as his father aged. But now she wondered if there had been other reasons for his absence, both physical and emotional. Kate. Sarah's voice was gentle, concerned. Are you all right? Catherine almost laughed at the question. Was she all right? She was battling cancer, trying to raise 3 children in the public eye, supporting her husband as he prepared for his future role as king, and now discovering that her marriage might be a sham. All right seemed like an impossible standard to meet. But she was a princess, and princesses did not fall apart, no matter what private hells they endured. She turned back to Sarah, her expression composed despite the chaos in her heart. Thank you for bringing this to me. I know it couldn't have been easy. What are you going to do? Sarah asked. Catherine considered the question. What could she do? Confront William? Demand explanations for photographs that might have innocent explanations? Begin divorce proceedings that would tear apart the monarchy and traumatize her children? Pretend she had never seen the evidence and hope it never came to light? I don't know yet, she admitted. But I need time to think, to decide how to handle this. Sarah nodded and began gathering the photographs back into the envelope. But Catherine stopped her. Leave them, Catherine said. I may need them. As Sarah prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. Kate, for what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope there's an innocent explanation for everything I saw. You deserve better than this. After Sarah departed, Catherine remained alone in the blue drawing room, staring at the envelope that contained the potential destruction of her marriage and her family's future. Through the windows, she could see the late afternoon sun beginning to cast long shadows across the grounds. Somewhere in the palace, she knew King Charles was probably wondering about her mysterious visitor. Soon, William would return from Scotland with flowers and apologies for his early departure, never knowing that his wife now carried the weight of his potential betrayal. Catherine picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. Then, she slipped it into her purse and prepared to return to her private apartments, where she would have to decide what kind of woman she wanted to be. The kind who pretended not to see, or the kind who demanded the truth, regardless of the cost. The evening hours stretched endlessly as Catherine sat in her private study, the manila envelope lying unopened on the mahogany desk before her like an unexploded bomb. She had dismissed her lady-in-waiting early, claiming fatigue, and now found herself alone with the crushing weight of what she had learned. The children were in the nursery wing, safely occupied with their evening routines under the watchful eyes of their nanny. George was likely finishing his mathematics homework with his characteristic determination, while Charlotte practiced piano with the single-minded focus she brought to everything she attempted. Little Louis would be having his bath, chattering away about his day with the innocent joy that belonged to 5-year-olds who still believed the world was fundamentally good and safe. How could she look at them tomorrow morning, knowing what she now knew about their father? How could she sit across from William at breakfast, discussing schedules and obligations, while the photographs burned in her mind like acid? A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She quickly slipped the envelope into the desk drawer and called for whoever was there to enter. King Charles stepped into the room, still wearing his formal day clothes despite the late hour. His presence filled the space with the quiet authority he had carried since childhood, but his eyes held a gentleness that had become more pronounced since her cancer diagnosis. He had surprised her with his attentiveness during her treatment, checking on her progress personally rather than simply receiving reports through staff. Catherine, my dear, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk without invitation. In private moments like these, protocol relaxed considerably between them. James mentioned you had a visitor today, someone from your university years. Catherine felt her stomach clench. She had hoped to have more time to process Sarah's revelations before having to discuss them with anyone, especially Charles. The king had always been protective of the family's reputation, and she knew he would want to understand any potential threats to the monarchy's stability. Yes, she said carefully. An old friend who was passing through London. Nothing significant. Charles studied her face with the keen perception that had made him an effective heir apparent for decades. He had learned to read people, to sense the undercurrents that others missed. Catherine realized immediately that her casual dismissal had not convinced him. Catherine, he said gently, in my experience, old friends rarely travel across continents for casual visits, particularly not old friends who request formal audiences through palace protocol. She should have known that Charles would have been briefed on the unusual circumstances of Sarah's arrival. Very little happened within the royal household without his knowledge, especially since he had become king. The weight of the crown had made him even more vigilant about potential crises. She's a journalist now, Catherine admitted, knowing that withholding information from Charles would only make the situation worse if it eventually came to light. She's been working in Canada for several years. The word journalist made Charles's expression sharpen slightly. In their world, journalists were both necessary allies and potential threats, depending on their intentions and the stories they chose to pursue. And what brings a Canadian journalist to request a private audience with the Princess of Wales? He asked, his tone remaining gentle but gaining an edge of genuine concern. Catherine found herself at a crossroads. She could continue deflecting, claim that Sarah's visit was purely social, and hope that nothing further came of the situation. Or she could be honest with Charles about what she had learned, potentially setting in motion a series of events that could shake the monarchy to its core. The silence stretched between them as Catherine wrestled with her decision. Charles waited patiently, a skill he had perfected over decades of difficult conversations with prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and family members. She showed me some photographs, Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles leaned forward slightly, his full attention focused on her words. What kind of photographs? Of William. Taken during his trip to Cape Town 3 months ago. Catherine's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. He was with a woman. Someone who isn't his wife. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Charles's expression didn't change dramatically. He had spent too many years in public life to allow his emotions to show easily, but Catherine saw something flicker in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. Or maybe just the weary resignation of a man who had dealt with royal scandals before. How compromising were these photographs? He asked, his voice steady and professional. Catherine appreciated that he didn't immediately dismiss her concerns or demand to see the evidence. Instead, he was approaching the situation like the experienced leader he was, gathering information before making judgments. Compromising enough, she said. They were clearly intimate. And she was wearing my grandmother's sapphire necklace. Charles's eyes closed briefly at this detail. The necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of Catherine's position and the trust that had been placed in her when she married William. For another woman to be wearing it suggested a level of intimacy and presumption that went far beyond a casual affair. Do we know who this woman is? He asked. Isabella Montague, an art consultant. She was at the summit on business. Catherine found herself reciting the facts like a news report, trying to maintain emotional distance from information that felt like knives in her heart. Charles nodded slowly, and Catherine realized he was probably already thinking about damage control, about how to manage the situation if it became public knowledge. She felt a flash of resentment, not at Charles personally, but at the system that made her personal tragedy a matter of state concern. Catherine, Charles said, his voice softer now. Have you spoken to William about this? He's not due back from Scotland until tomorrow afternoon. She paused, then added, I'm not sure what I'm going to say to him when he returns. What does your heart tell you to do? The question surprised her. She had expected royal protocol, discussions of public relations strategy, conversations about how to minimize scandal. Instead, Charles was asking about her feelings, her instincts as a wife and a woman. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to confront him immediately, to demand explanations and promises that this will never happen again. But another part of me is terrified of what I might learn if I push too hard. Charles was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing his words carefully. As king, he had to think about the monarchy's stability. As William's father, he had to consider his son's welfare. And, as Catherine's father-in-law, he had responsibilities to her as well. May I see these photographs? He asked finally. Catherine hesitated. Showing Charles the evidence would make the situation real in a way that keeping it private between herself and Sarah had not. Once the king knew the full scope of what had happened, there would be no going back to ignorance or denial. But she realized she needed advice from someone who understood both the personal and political ramifications of what she was facing. Charles had navigated his own marital difficulties in the public eye, had survived scandals that could have destroyed the monarchy, and had emerged as a respected leader despite his personal failings. She opened the desk drawer and withdrew the envelope, sliding it across to Charles without a word. He opened it carefully, his expression neutral as he studied each photograph. Catherine watched his face, looking for any reaction that might give her insight into his thoughts. When he finished, he placed the photographs back in the envelope and looked at her directly. "These are troubling," he said simply. "And I'm sorry you're having to deal with this, particularly while you're still recovering from your treatment." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at his kindness. She had been so focused on the potential political implications that she had almost forgotten the personal cost of what she was experiencing. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you were in my position?" Charles considered the question seriously. "I think," he said slowly, "that you need to speak to William directly. These photographs raise serious questions that only he can answer. And, regardless of what those answers are, you deserve the truth. And if the truth is what I think it is, if he's been unfaithful, then you'll have to decide what kind of future you want, both for yourself and for your children. The monarchy will survive whatever decisions you make, Catherine. It always has. But you have to be able to live with yourself." Catherine felt something shift inside her chest at his words. For years, she had felt the weight of royal duty, the sense that her personal happiness was secondary to the institution she served. To hear Charles, the king himself, tell her that her own welfare mattered was both liberating and terrifying. "There's something else," she said, knowing she needed to share all the information Sarah had given her. "According to my friend, there may be other women. Other trips where William has been seen in compromising situations." Charles's jaw tightened slightly. A pattern of infidelity was far more serious than a single indiscretion. It suggested character issues that could have long-term implications for William's fitness as future king. "Do you have evidence of these other incidents?" "No, just rumors and speculation. But my friend is an investigative journalist. She knows how to verify information before acting on it. If she's concerned about a pattern, there's probably something to it." Charles stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the dark grounds. Catherine could see his reflection in the glass, the weight of decision-making evident in his posture. "I'm going to ask you to wait before confronting William," he said finally, turning back to face her. "Give me 24 hours to make some discreet inquiries. If there are other incidents, other women, I want to know about them before you have that conversation." Catherine felt a mixture of relief and frustration at his request. Part of her wanted to charge ahead, to confront William immediately and demand answers. But another part recognized the wisdom in gathering all available information before making decisions that could affect not just her marriage, but the future of the monarchy. "What kind of inquiries?" she asked. "The kind that won't compromise anyone's privacy unless absolutely necessary," Charles assured her. "I have resources that can verify or disprove rumors without creating additional scandal." Catherine nodded, though she wondered if 24 hours would feel like an eternity. Already, the weight of what she knew was crushing down on her, making it difficult to breathe normally. "There's one more thing you should know," Charles said, moving back toward the door. "I had a brief conversation with William yesterday evening after his event in Edinburgh. He mentioned that he's been struggling with some personal issues lately, feeling overwhelmed by his responsibilities and the pressure of your illness." Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. Was Charles preparing her for William's justifications? Was he suggesting that her cancer diagnosis had somehow driven her husband into the arms of another woman? "What exactly did he say?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Nothing specific. Just that he's been feeling the strain of carrying more royal duties while you've been unwell. And that he's worried about the children, about how they're processing your diagnosis." Charles paused. "I mention this because his state of mind might be relevant to understanding whatever has happened." Catherine wanted to scream. The idea that her illness, something she had no control over, might be used to excuse William's infidelity was almost more painful than the betrayal itself. She had fought cancer while maintaining her royal duties, supporting her children, and trying to be a good wife. If William had sought comfort elsewhere instead of standing by her side, that said something fundamental about his character. But she kept her voice level when she responded. "I understand, and I appreciate you handling this discreetly." Charles moved to the door, then paused. "Catherine, whatever you discover about William's behavior, please know that you have my complete support. You've been an exemplary princess, wife, and mother. Nothing that has happened is your fault." After he left, Catherine sat alone with her thoughts and the envelope that contained evidence of her husband's betrayal. Tomorrow, she would have to pretend everything was normal when William returned. She would have to smile and listen to his stories about Scotland while wondering who he had been thinking about when he was away. The cancer treatments had taught her that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Now she was about to discover just how much strength she would need to survive the destruction of her marriage and the potential collapse of everything she had built her adult life around. She thought about calling her sister, Pippa, but realized she wasn't ready to make this real by sharing it with anyone else. Instead, she sat in the growing darkness of her study, holding the envelope and trying to prepare herself for whatever truths the next 24 hours would reveal. Outside her window, the palace grounds were quiet and still, giving no indication of the storm that was brewing within its walls. By this time tomorrow, Catherine knew her life would be fundamentally different. The only question was whether it would still be recognizably her own. The next morning arrived with a cruel brightness that seemed to mock Catherine's sleepless night. She had spent hours staring at the ceiling, alternating between rage and despair, trying to reconcile the William she thought she knew with the man in Sarah's photographs. When her lady-in-waiting knocked at 7:30 with morning tea, Catherine was already dressed and sitting at her writing desk, attempting to maintain some semblance of normal routine. "Your Royal Highness," Mary said quietly as she set down the tea service. "His Royal Highness called about an hour ago. His flight from Edinburgh has been delayed by weather, but he expects to arrive by mid-afternoon." Catherine nodded, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when she thanked Mary. A few more hours of reprieve, then. A few more hours before she would have to look into William's eyes and pretend she didn't know what she knew. The morning engagements passed in a blur of carefully maintained composure. She attended a briefing about upcoming charitable commitments, reviewed correspondence with her private secretary, and participated in a video call with the trustees of her early childhood foundation. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the same dedicated princess she had always been, focused and engaged with her responsibilities. But underneath the polished exterior, Catherine felt as though she was fracturing into pieces. Every smile felt false. Every conversation required enormous effort to maintain focus. She found herself studying the faces of her staff, wondering who else might know about William's infidelities, who might be looking at her with pity or judgment. Just before noon, James appeared in her office doorway with an expression that had become familiar over the past 24 hours, the careful neutrality that suggested difficult news. "Your Royal Highness, His Majesty has asked if you might join him in his private office at your earliest convenience." Catherine's stomach dropped. Charles had promised to make discreet inquiries about William's behavior, and his request for an urgent meeting suggested he had learned something significant. She followed James through the corridors of the palace, noting how the ornate decorations and priceless artwork that usually comforted her now felt like the trappings of a gilded cage. Charles was waiting for her in his private study, a room that managed to be both grand and intimate, filled with personal photographs, books, and the comfortable clutter that accumulated around someone who actually used their workspace. He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs near his desk, and she noticed that he had prepared tea for both of them, a gesture that suggested this conversation might take some time. "I've been making inquiries," he said without preamble, "and I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we initially understood." Catherine braced herself, gripping the arms of her chair. "How much more complex?" Charles opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several documents. "There have been at least 3 occasions over the past year where William has been seen in the company of women who are not his wife, in circumstances that suggest intimacy rather than professional relationships." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. Not just Isabella Montague, then. Not just one moment of weakness or poor judgment. A pattern of behavior that spoke to something fundamentally wrong in their marriage. "Who?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she really wanted to know. "Besides Miss Montague, there's a French cultural attaché named Marie Dubois, whom William met during a state visit to Paris 6 months ago, and an American philanthropist named Jessica Kane, who was involved in his Earthshot Prize activities in Los Angeles." Catherine felt nauseated. Each name represented another betrayal, another moment when William had chosen someone else over his commitment to her and their family. She thought about the children, about how they adored their father, and wondered how she would ever explain this to them if it became public knowledge. "How certain are you about these relationships?" she asked. "Certain enough to be concerned," Charles replied carefully. "There are photographs, witness accounts, hotel records that place them in the same locations at the same times. Nothing that would constitute legal proof of adultery, but enough to establish a pattern of inappropriate behavior." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this information settling into her bones. She had hoped, despite the evidence Sarah had shown her, that there might be innocent explanations. That William might have been indiscreet, but not actually unfaithful. These revelations destroyed any possibility of such optimistic interpretations. There's more, Charles continued gently. I've also discovered that William has been using a personal credit card for certain expenses that he hasn't disclosed to the palace financial office. Hotel rooms, jewelry purchases, travel arrangements that don't correspond to his official itinerary. The mention of jewelry made Catherine's blood run cold. She thought about her grandmother's sapphire necklace, now probably hanging in Isabella Montague's jewelry box like a trophy. How many other pieces had William given away? How many symbols of their relationship had been repurposed as gifts for his mistresses? How long have you known? She asked suddenly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. Charles looked uncomfortable for the first time since the conversation began. I've had concerns for several months, but nothing concrete until yesterday. William's behavior has been erratic lately, more secretive than usual, more defensive when questioned about his activities. Catherine realized that Charles might have suspected William's infidelity before she did, that her own husband's father had been watching him with growing concern while she remained oblivious. The thought made her feel both naive and humiliated. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked. Because I hoped I was wrong, Charles admitted. And because I knew that once this information became real, it would change everything for you and the children. I wanted to be absolutely certain before placing that burden on your shoulders. Catherine appreciated his consideration, but she also felt a flash of anger. While Charles had been discreetly investigating, she had been living a lie, playing the role of loving wife while her husband betrayed her repeatedly. She wondered how many palace staff knew or suspected, how many official events she had attended while whispers followed in her wake. What happens now? She asked. Charles leaned back in his chair, and Catherine could see the weight of kingship in his expression. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. It was about the stability of the monarchy, about public trust in the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. That depends on what you want to happen, he said carefully, and on what William has to say when confronted with this evidence. You're going to confront him? We're going to confront him. Together. This affects both of you, and both of your perspectives need to be heard. Catherine felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of finally forcing the truth into the open. She had been dreading her conversation with William, uncertain how to approach such devastating revelations. Having Charles present would provide both moral support and ensure that the conversation remained focused on facts rather than dissolving into emotional accusations. When? She asked. As soon as he returns from Scotland. I've asked James to arrange for William to come directly to my office before he goes to your apartments. He thinks it's about scheduling for next month's state visit. Catherine almost smiled at the irony. William would arrive expecting to discuss mundane royal business, and instead find himself facing the complete exposure of his secret life. I need you to understand something, Charles continued, his tone becoming more serious. Depending on how William responds to this confrontation, we may be looking at a constitutional crisis. If he admits to the affairs, and you decide you want a separation or divorce, the implications for his future as king will be significant. Catherine had been so focused on the personal betrayal that she hadn't fully considered the broader ramifications. William was the heir to the throne, the future king of England. If their marriage collapsed publicly, it would raise questions about his judgment, his character, his fitness to rule. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but always at a cost. Are you saying I should stay married to protect the institution? She asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. I'm saying that whatever decision you make, we need to understand all the consequences, Charles replied. Both personal and political. You have every right to leave William if that's what you choose. But you also deserve to know what that choice would mean for your children's future, for the stability of the crown, for your own position within the royal family. Catherine felt the familiar weight of royal duty pressing down on her shoulders. Even in the midst of personal crisis, she was expected to consider the greater good, to weigh her own happiness against the needs of the nation. It was a burden she had carried since the day she married William, but it felt particularly cruel now when her world was crumbling around her. What about the children? She asked. How do we protect them from this? If the situation becomes public, we'll need a comprehensive strategy for managing the media coverage and minimizing the impact on George, Charlotte, and Louis. But, Catherine, I want you to know that regardless of what happens between you and William, your place in this family is secure. You're the mother of the future king, and that position comes with certain protections and privileges that no amount of scandal can take away. Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah had shown her the photographs. She had been so focused on her role as William's wife that she had forgotten her independent value to the monarchy. Whatever happened to their marriage, she would always be the Princess of Wales, always be the children's mother, always have a place in the institution she had served with such dedication. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. James entered with his usual discreet efficiency, but Catherine could see tension in his posture. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," he said formally. "His Royal Highness has arrived from Scotland." His car just passed through the gates. Catherine's heart began racing immediately. After hours of speculation and dread, the moment of truth was finally approaching. In minutes, she would be sitting across from William as he learned that his secret life had been exposed, that his betrayals were known, that his marriage was in jeopardy. "Thank you, James," Charles said. "Please ask His Royal Highness to come directly here. Tell him I need to discuss some urgent matters before he settles in." After James departed, Catherine and Charles sat in tense silence. She found herself thinking about the early days of her relationship with William, when they were just university students navigating the complex waters of young love. He had been charming then, attentive and devoted, seemingly incapable of the calculated deception that characterized his recent behavior. When had it changed? When had the man she married become someone who could look her in the eyes while maintaining relationships with other women? Was it the pressure of royal duty that had corrupted him, or had she simply been naive about his character from the beginning? "Catherine," Charles said quietly, "whatever happens in the next few minutes, remember that you've done nothing wrong. You've been an exemplary wife and mother, and no amount of blame or justification from William can change that fact." She nodded, grateful for his support, but still terrified of what was coming. Through the windows of Charles's office, she could see the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the palace grounds. By the time that sun set, her marriage might be over, her children's lives might be turned upside down, and the future of the monarchy might be in question. But she would face whatever came with the dignity and strength that had carried her through cancer treatment and years of public scrutiny. William had made his choices, and now she would have to make hers. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her heart pound. William was coming, and, with him, the reckoning that would determine the rest of her life. William entered his father's office with the easy confidence that had always characterized him, his travel clothes slightly rumpled, but his smile genuine as he greeted them both. Catherine watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or awareness that his secret life was about to be exposed. Instead, she saw only the familiar warmth he had always shown her, the same expression that had greeted her thousands of times over their years together. "Father, Catherine," he said, moving to kiss her cheek in the casual intimacy of long marriage. "Sorry about the delay. The weather in Scotland was absolutely dreadful." Catherine felt her body tense as he touched her, the simple gesture now feeling like a violation. She managed to return his smile, but she could see Charles watching her carefully, monitoring her reaction. "William," Charles said, his tone measured and serious, "please sit down. We need to discuss some urgent matters." Something in his father's voice made William's expression shift slightly. Catherine watched as his natural confidence wavered, replaced by the cautious alertness that came from years of navigating royal protocol and potential crises. "Is everything all right?" William asked, taking the chair across from Catherine. "Is it about Catherine's treatment? The children?" Catherine felt a bitter irony in his immediate concern for her health and their family. If he was so worried about their well-being, why had he spent the past years systematically betraying them? "In a manner of speaking, yes," Charles replied. "William, we've received some information that raises serious questions about your conduct during recent overseas trips." Catherine watched as William's face went through a series of micro-expressions: confusion, wariness, and then something that looked suspiciously like fear. He glanced between his father and Catherine, clearly trying to assess what they knew and how much trouble he might be in. "What kind of information?" he asked carefully. Instead of answering verbally, Charles opened the folder on his desk and withdrew the photographs Sarah had provided, along with additional images his own investigators had gathered. He spread them across the coffee table between the three chairs like evidence in a criminal trial. Catherine watched William's face as he recognized the images, saw the exact moment when he understood that his secret life had been discovered. The color drained from his face, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for one of the photographs showing him with Isabella Montague. "Where did these come from?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not the relevant question, Charles replied firmly. The relevant question is whether you can explain what we're seeing. William set the photograph down and looked directly at Catherine for the first time since the evidence had been revealed. She saw everything in his expression: guilt, shame, desperation, and something that might have been relief that the pretense was finally over. Catherine, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Don't, she said quietly. Don't say my name like that. Don't use that tone with me. Just tell us the truth. William's composure cracked slightly, and Catherine could see the boy he had been beneath the man he had become. But she felt no sympathy for his distress, only a cold anger that he had put them all in this position. It's not what it looks like, he said finally, the words sounding hollow even as he spoke them. Really? Catherine's voice was dangerously calm. Because it looks like you've been having affairs with multiple women while I've been fighting cancer and trying to hold our family together. William flinched as though she had struck him. Catherine, please, let me explain. Then, explain, Charles interrupted. Explain why you were photographed in intimate situations with at least 3 different women over the past year. Explain why you gave Catherine's grandmother's necklace to another woman. Explain why you've been using personal funds to pay for hotel rooms and gifts that weren't disclosed to the royal household. Each accusation hit William like a physical blow. Catherine could see him realizing the scope of what had been discovered, understanding that this wasn't about one indiscretion that might be explained away, but about a pattern of deception that had been thoroughly documented. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said finally, his voice breaking. It started as nothing, just conversations with interesting people during official events. I never intended for it to become anything more. But it did become more, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. With Isabella. With Marie. With Jessica. How many others, William? How many women have you been with while I've been going through chemotherapy? William's face crumpled, and Catherine realized he was crying. She had seen him cry before, at their wedding, when the children were born, during her cancer diagnosis. But this was different. These weren't tears of joy or concern, but of shame and self-pity. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know how it got so out of control. The pressure, the expectations, watching you suffer and not being able to fix it. I just needed something that felt normal, something that wasn't about duty or responsibility. Catherine felt her anger crystallize into something cold and sharp. So you decided to find comfort with other women instead of supporting your wife through the most difficult period of her life. It wasn't like that, William protested, but his words sounded weak even to himself. Then what was it like? Charles demanded. Explain to us how betraying your wife and your family was somehow justified by pressure and expectations. William looked between them, clearly searching for words that might make his behavior understandable, forgivable. Catherine could see him trying to construct a narrative that would minimize his responsibility and maximize their sympathy. You don't understand what it's like, he said finally. To know that everything you do is watched, judged, recorded. To carry the weight of the monarchy's future while watching the person you love suffer and knowing there's nothing you can do to help. I needed something that was mine, something private and real. Your affairs were real, Catherine said bitterly. But your marriage apparently wasn't. That's not true, William said desperately. Catherine, you have to believe me. These women, they didn't mean anything. They were distractions, nothing more. You're my wife, the mother of my children, the only woman I've ever truly loved. Catherine stood up abruptly, unable to sit still while listening to his justifications. If they meant nothing, then you threw away our marriage for nothing. If they meant something, then you're a liar as well as an adulterer. Either way, I don't see how this conversation helps. William rose as well, reaching toward her, but she stepped back before he could touch her. The gesture seemed to break something inside him, and his tears fell harder. Please, Catherine, don't do this. Think about the children, about our family. We can work through this. I'll end all contact with these women. I'll do whatever you need me to do. Just don't give up on us. You gave up on us, Catherine replied. Every time you touched another woman, every time you lied to me about your activities, every time you chose someone else over your wife and children. I didn't destroy this marriage, William. You did. Charles had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to assess damage and determine next steps. Now he stood as well, his presence reminding them both that this wasn't just a private marital dispute, but a matter of state. William, he said quietly, I need you to understand the full scope of what you've done. This isn't just about your marriage to Catherine. Your behavior has implications for your future role as king, for the stability of the monarchy, for public trust in the royal family. William turned to his father with something like desperation in his eyes. Are you saying you want me to abdicate? I'm saying that we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we can determine how to move forward, Charles replied. How many women have there been, William? How many relationships? How many indiscretions that might come to light? William's silence stretched on for so long that Catherine began to wonder if he was even capable of honest self-reflection. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet they had to strain to hear him. I don't know exactly. Maybe a dozen over the past 2 years. Some were just conversations, flirtations that didn't go anywhere. Others were. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. A dozen. Catherine felt her knees weaken at the scope of his betrayal. Not just the 3 women they had evidence about, but nearly a dozen casual encounters that he had hidden from her while she fought for her life. My God, William, she whispered. How did you look at me every day knowing what you were doing? How did you kiss me goodnight, and then plan your next affair? I hated myself for it, he said desperately. Every single time, I promised myself it would be the last. I never wanted to hurt you, Catherine. You have to believe that. But you did hurt me, Catherine replied, feeling tears threatening for the first time since this nightmare began. You've destroyed everything we built together, everything I believed about our relationship, about who you are as a person. Charles moved toward the window, giving them space for this intimate exchange while clearly thinking about the larger implications. Catherine could see him trying to balance his roles as father, king, and protector of the monarchy. William, Charles said finally, I need you to prepare a complete list of every woman you've been involved with, every situation that might potentially become public knowledge. We need to know what we're defending against. William nodded miserably, clearly understanding that his father was already thinking in terms of damage control and crisis management. And, Catherine, Charles continued, I need you to decide what you want your future to look like. Not today, but soon. The palace will support whatever decision you make, but we need to know where you stand so we can plan accordingly. Catherine looked at William, this man she had loved for more than half her adult life, and tried to find any trace of the person she had married. Instead, she saw a stranger who had systematically betrayed her while she fought for her life, who had given away her grandmother's jewelry to his mistresses, who had turned their marriage into an elaborate lie. I can't do this anymore, she said quietly. I can't pretend that we can work through this, that this is just a rough patch in our marriage. You've been living a double life for years, William. You've made me complicit in your lies by keeping me ignorant. I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't think I want to. William's face crumpled completely at her words, but Catherine felt no satisfaction in his pain. She felt only exhaustion, sadness, and a strange sense of relief that the pretense was finally over. The room fell silent except for William's quiet sobs and the ticking of the antique clock on Charles's mantelpiece. Outside, the palace grounds were growing dark as evening approached, and Catherine realized that by tomorrow, everything would be different. The children would have to be told something, the staff would need guidance on how to handle the situation, and she would have to begin the process of rebuilding her life from the ashes of her marriage. But, for now, she simply stood in the growing darkness, watching the man she had loved fall apart, and tried to summon the strength to face whatever came next. 3 hours later, Catherine sat alone in her private sitting room, staring out at the palace gardens that had become invisible in the darkness. William had left Charles's office in devastation, stumbling through apologies and promises that rang hollow in the wake of his revelations. Charles had quietly arranged for him to stay in a guest suite in another wing of the palace, giving Catherine space to process everything she had learned. The children were safely asleep in the nursery wing, blissfully unaware that their world had fundamentally shifted during their evening bath and bedtime stories. Tomorrow, Catherine would have to find words to explain why their father would no longer be living with them, at least temporarily. The thought of George's confused questions, Charlotte's quiet understanding that something was wrong, and Louis's innocent acceptance of whatever adults told him made her chest ache with grief. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Henderson stood in the doorway, looking uncertain and deeply concerned. Catherine had asked James to contact her that afternoon, needing to speak with the one person who had witnessed this nightmare from the beginning. Your Royal Highness, Sarah said formally, then caught herself. Kate, I'm so sorry. When I brought those photographs to you, I never imagined that there would be so many others. Catherine finished. Neither did I. Please, sit down. I need to thank you for having the courage to come forward. Sarah settled into the chair across from her, still looking uncomfortable with the formality of the situation. How are you holding up? Catherine almost laughed at the question. I honestly don't know. This morning I thought I was dealing with one affair. This evening I've learned that my entire marriage has been a facade. I'm not sure how anyone holds up under those circumstances. And William is staying elsewhere in the palace tonight. We can't even look at each other right now. Catherine paused, then added, Sarah, I need to ask you something. As a journalist, how long do you think we have before this becomes public knowledge? Sarah's expression grew troubled. That depends on several factors. How discreet have these women been? How many people witnessed William's behavior? How motivated is anyone to sell their story to the tabloids? Charles is having his security team investigate the scope of potential exposure. But, realistically, something this extensive, involving this many people. Catherine trailed off, knowing they were both thinking the same thing. Kate, you need to be prepared for the possibility that someone will go public within days or weeks, not months, Sarah said gently. William is the heir to the throne. His infidelity is one of the biggest stories any journalist could break. The financial incentives alone are enormous. Catherine nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. Which means I need to make some decisions quickly about how I want to handle this. What are your options? Catherine had been asking herself the same question for hours. I can try to save the marriage, work through this privately, and hope it never becomes public. I can separate quietly and maintain the fiction of a united royal family. Or I can divorce him and face whatever consequences that brings for the children and the monarchy. What does your heart tell you to do? It was the same question Charles had asked her, and Catherine still didn't have a clear answer. My heart tells me to protect my children and my own dignity. But I also have responsibilities to the institution, to the country, to the future of the monarchy. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. Kate, can I tell you something as your friend, not as a journalist? You don't owe the monarchy your happiness. You don't owe William forgiveness for systematically betraying you while you were fighting for your life. And you don't owe the public a performance of marital bliss when your husband has been living a lie for years. The words hit Catherine like a revelation. For so long, she had defined herself primarily through her roles: wife, mother, princess. The idea that her personal welfare might be more important than institutional stability felt both revolutionary and terrifying. But the children, Catherine said. George is going to be king someday. If I divorce William, how does that affect his future? His relationship with his father? The public's perception of the royal family. The children need a mother who models self-respect and integrity, Sarah replied firmly. They need to learn that love doesn't mean accepting betrayal, that marriage doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity for the sake of appearances. What message are you sending them if you stay with a man who has shown such fundamental disrespect for your relationship? Before Catherine could respond, James appeared in the doorway with his usual discreet efficiency. Your Royal Highness, His Majesty would like to speak with you when convenient. He's in his private study. Catherine excused herself and made her way through the now familiar corridors to Charles's office. She found him standing by the windows, still dressed despite the late hour, with documents spread across his desk that suggested he had been working on the crisis since William's departure. How are you feeling? He asked without preamble. Numb, angry, scared, relieved that it's finally out in the open. Catherine settled into the same chair she had occupied during that afternoon's devastating revelations. Have you learned anything new? Charles turned from the window, his expression grave. My security team has identified at least 5 additional women who may have been involved with William over the past 18 months. We're also dealing with financial irregularities that suggest he's been more reckless with palace resources than we initially understood. Catherine felt the last of her hope for salvaging the marriage dissolve. How reckless? Unauthorized use of royal transportation for personal trips, undisclosed gifts charged to palace accounts, hotel rooms, and travel expenses that don't correspond to any official engagements. Charles paused. Catherine, we may be looking at criminal charges for misuse of public funds. The words sent a chill through her. It was one thing to deal with infidelity, quite another to face the possibility that William had committed actual crimes in pursuit of his affairs. What does this mean for his position as heir? She asked. Charles was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him wrestling with the implications. That depends partly on what you decide to do about your marriage, and partly on whether any criminal charges are filed. Parliament might demand his removal from the line of succession if the misconduct is serious enough. Catherine felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Her personal decision about whether to forgive her husband's infidelity could potentially reshape the British monarchy for generations to come. I need you to know, Charles continued, that regardless of what happens between you and William, your position in this family is secure. You're an exemplary mother and an asset to the crown in your own right. If you choose to divorce William, you'll retain your title and your role in royal duties. The children will remain in the line of succession, and you'll continue to be their primary guardian. Catherine felt tears threaten for the first time that evening. Throughout this nightmare, she had been terrified of losing not just her marriage but her entire identity, her place in the only adult life she had ever known. And if I choose to stay with him, then we'll work together to manage the public relations crisis and hope that his affairs remain private. But, Catherine, I need you to understand that staying married to William won't guarantee that this information remains secret. It might simply mean that you're standing beside him when it all comes crashing down. Catherine thought about Sarah's warning that the story could break at any moment, about the dozen or more women who knew intimate details about William's deception, about the financial records that painted a picture of systematic misconduct. I think, she said slowly, that I've already made my decision. I just need the courage to follow through with it. Charles nodded, as though he had expected this conclusion. What do you need from me? Help telling the children. Help managing the transition so that their lives are disrupted as little as possible. And help ensuring that William understands that his behavior has consequences, even for future kings. You'll have all of that, Charles assured her. And, Catherine, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. William needs to face the consequences of his actions, and you deserve better than a marriage built on deception. Catherine felt a strange sense of peace settling over her as she spoke the words that would reshape her future. I want a divorce. I want William to move out of our shared apartments permanently. And I want to tell the children myself, before any rumors or speculation reach them. When do you want to have that conversation with William? Tomorrow morning. I've spent enough nights lying in bed next to a man I can't trust. I won't do it again. Charles moved to his desk and picked up a phone, making arrangements with quiet efficiency. Catherine realized he was calling his legal team, his communications director, his security chief, all the people who would need to be involved in managing the dissolution of a royal marriage. As she listened to him coordinate the response to her personal crisis, Catherine felt the last of her old life slipping away. Tomorrow, she would be a separated woman, a single mother, a princess without a prince. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. But she would face whatever came next with the same strength that had carried her through cancer treatment and years of public scrutiny. William had made his choices, and now she was making hers. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with none of the storm clouds that seemed appropriate for such a momentous day. Catherine had barely slept, but she felt clearer than she had in months as she prepared for the conversation that would officially end her marriage. William was waiting for her in the same sitting room where she had first learned about his betrayal, looking haggard and desperate. When she entered, he stood immediately, hope flickering in his eyes. Catherine, thank you for seeing me. I've been thinking all night about what I can do to fix this, how I can prove to you that our marriage is worth fighting for. Stop, Catherine said quietly. Please just stop. The hope died in his expression as he registered her tone, the finality in her voice. I'm filing for divorce, William. I've already spoken with Charles, and the legal proceedings will begin immediately. You'll need to move out of our apartments today. William's face crumpled, but Catherine felt no satisfaction in his pain, only sadness for what they had lost and relief that the pretense was finally over. The children, he whispered, will be told that their father made choices that hurt their mother, and that sometimes grown-ups can't live together anymore even when they both love their children very much, Catherine said firmly. They'll still see you regularly, but you won't be lying to them anymore about who you are. William tried to speak, to offer more apologies and promises, but Catherine was already moving toward the door. She had said everything she needed to say, made all the decisions that were hers to make. As she walked through the palace corridors toward the nursery wing, where her children were having breakfast and preparing for another day in lives that were about to change forever, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She had survived cancer, and she would survive this too. She would rebuild her life around truth instead of deception, around self-respect instead of duty to a man who had betrayed everything they had built together. The children would have questions, the public would have opinions, and the monarchy would adapt as it always had to personal scandals and constitutional crises. But Catherine would face whatever came next as herself, finally, free from the weight of loving someone who had proven himself unworthy of that gift. Through the windows of the palace, the morning sun was rising over London, bringing light to corners that had been shrouded in darkness. It seemed, Catherine thought, like an appropriate metaphor for whatever came next.